Welcome to the debate. You know, when we look at an ancient map of the world, we're culturally conditioned to expect blank spaces.
Right. We just picture empty sand.
Exactly. We imagine these vast, empty deserts where isolated tribes practice simple, primitive traditions, completely cut off from the great empires of the Mediterranean or Persia. But, well, when you actually start digging into the sand, those blank spaces vanish entirely.
Yeah, they really do.
Instead, you find bustling, crowded superhighways, and not just of spices and the incense trade, but superhighways of theology. Today, we are looking at one of the most consequential theological intersections in human history, which is the pre-Islamic Arabian goddesses Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat.
And specifically, we're looking at how they are remembered. Because, the way we remember these three deities is almost entirely dictated by the text that eventually dismantled them.
The Quran.
Right. In the Quran, specifically in Surah An-Najm, these three powerful figures are intensely criticized, and they're famously reduced to a very specific title, the Daughters of Allah.
Which leaves us with a massive mystery.
A fascinating historical and textual mystery, yes. Are we looking at a literal theology held by the Meccans, or are we looking at a masterful, calculated, rhetorical takedown by the Quranic text?
Exactly. That is our central question today. Did the pre-Islamic Arabs genuinely possess a lived, structured theology where these goddesses functioned as the subordinate offspring and intermediaries of Allah?
Right.
I will be arguing that they absolutely did, and that the text is confronting a genuine system of shared sacred authority.
And I will be arguing the opposite. I think that the Daughters of Allah phrasing is a brilliant piece of polemical judo.
Polemical judo? Okay.
Yeah, the text is intentionally simplifying and demoting powerful, globalized deities into subordinate daughters, basically to score a socio-theological victory.
Well, let me lay out why I think this intermediary theology was a genuine lived reality. We have to remember that early Islam did not exist in a vacuum. It was, born into the wider environment of late antiquity.
Right, a very spiritually crowded era.
Incredibly crowded. If you look at the entire region during this period, from the Byzantine Empire to Sasanian Persia, the cosmos was deeply populated by angels, saints, and heavenly mediators.
Sure, the whole region had them.
Exactly. People across the Near East believed in a supreme creator, but that creator was often viewed as distant, almost like an emperor. And to get the emperor's ear, you needed to go through his court.
Okay, I follow the analogy.
So I argue that the pre-Islamic Arabs had exactly this kind of structural framework. The Quran is attacking a genuine reality of what it calls associationism. This was a system where Allah was likely already recognized as the supreme creator.
But with a catch.
Right, a catch where Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat operated as literal, active intermediaries. The Meccans weren't atheists, and they weren't exactly classical polytheists who thought all gods were equal either.
They were associationalists.
Yes, they believed these goddesses brought them closer to the ultimate divine authority. The Quran isn't just inventing their subordinate status to make them easier to attack. It is targeting the exact mechanism of their theology.
See, I come at it from a completely different way. And it starts with looking at the physical evidence left by the worshippers themselves.
The archaeology.
The hard epigraphic record. When I look at the actual stones carved by the people who venerated Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, well, the silence is deafening.
How so?
We have countless inscriptions dedicated to these deities stretching across the entire region, from southern Arabia all the way up to modern-day Syria. Yet across all those hundreds of rock faces and temple walls, there is zero contemporary archaeological proof explicitly calling them the Daughters of Allah.
Okay, zero might be strong, but yes, it's scarce.
It is literally zero. Nothing. If this was the core pillar of their theology, as the text suggests, why didn't they carve it into their monuments?
That is the big question.
That's why I argue that the Quran is engaging in classical religious polemics. Think about what the text is trying to accomplish. It is trying to establish absolute, uncompromised monotheism.
Right.
To do that, it takes highly sophisticated, autonomous, globalized deities and it reframes them It shrinks them down. It recategorizes them as dependent, subordinate daughters.
Because it's a better target.
Exactly. It's much easier to convince an audience to abandon a dependent child deity than an autonomous cosmic power. What we are reading in Surah Al-Najm is a rhetorical shadow cast over a much more complex and much more formidable reality.
Okay, I understand why the lack of inscriptions gives you pause. But before we get into the linguistics, I want to talk about how you just frame them as autonomous, globalized deities.
Okay.
Because I think understanding their true scale actually helps explain why the Meccans felt the need to categorize them as intermediaries in the first place.
We definitely need to talk about their physical reality, because what archaeologists are pulling out of the ground completely shatters the myth of primitive, subordinate idols.
Right, they weren't just little statues.
Not at all. When people hear the word idol, they picture a crude little human figure made of clay, something primitive and hyper-localized to a single tent or village. But the archaeology reveals a breathtaking level of sophistication. Have you looked at the aniconic Baetyls?
The sacred stones, yes?
Right, but they aren't just rocks. Let's take Petra, the great Nabatean capital carved into the red cliffs of southern Jordan. At the Temple of the Winged Lions, archaeologists uncovered the Eye Baetyl of Al-Uzza.
It's a fascinating piece.
It is striking. It's not a human statue with arms and legs. It is a stark, minimalist limestone stele with two abstract, stylized eyes and a geometric nose. It functions as a placeholder. The worshippers understood that Al-Uzza was a cosmic force, too vast and abstract to be captured in a simple human form.
Which is a beautiful representation of ancient Semitic abstract traditions. I mean, it's a way of representing the divine presence without limiting it to a biological body.
Exactly. But it goes beyond just abstract art in a single desert city. These were not minor local desert spirits. They were globalized powers.
They were known everywhere.
Right. If you travel up the ancient incense routes to Palmyra, located in the Syrian desert, which was a major cosmopolitan hub connecting the Roman and Persian empires, French and Polish excavations found the Grand Temple of Al-Lat.
And her depiction there was very different.
Completely different. Inside that temple, her cult statue wasn't a raw block of stone. She was carved in the exact likeness of Athena Justiniani, the Greek goddess of war and wisdom.
Wearing the helmet and everything.
Yes. Furthermore, in Nabatean inscriptions, we frequently see Al-Lat and Al-Uzza listed alongside Dushara, their supreme king god, where they are treated as his consorts or equals.
Okay.
So when you look at the mechanics of this syncretism fused with Greco-Roman imperial cults, recognized from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, wearing the armor of Athena, does this really look like a subordinate daughter to you? Or does it look like an autonomous superpower?
I see the scale you're pointing to. You're looking at Al-Lat wearing the helmet of Athena and saying, this is no daughter. This is a titan.
Exactly.
But wait, hold on. I would argue that their massive global scale actually strengthens the case for a genuine intermediary theology. Let's go back to the late antique parallel I mentioned earlier.
The emperor's court idea?
Right. Think about how religious devotion worked structurally in the Byzantine Empire, which bordered this exact region. Think about St. George or the Archangel Michael.
Are you comparing the goddess of war to a Byzantine saint?
Structurally, yes. I mean, their veneration was massive. St. George had grand basilicas, international pilgrimage routes, highly sophisticated iconography.
Sure, he was a major figure.
And worshippers were begging him for rain, for healing, for victory in battle. He was a globalized superpower in his own right. But did his immense scale mean he wasn't subordinate to the creator? Of course not.
Well, in the minds of the Christians of late antiquity, his scale was a testament to his effectiveness as a mediator. A Byzantine saint had massive regional power, but remained structurally secondary to God.
I see your point, but...
And the pre-Islamic Arabs were deeply pragmatic merchants. They recognized Allah as the ultimate cosmic source, the creator of the heavens and the earth. But the creator is abstract. For their daily, earthly, practical needs, safe passage for their caravans, rain for their crops, they went to the mediators, to Al-Lat and Al-Uzza.
Right. So yes, they were massive, but they were massive mediators. The Quran isn't shrinking their scale, it's attacking their structural position.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy the saint analogy. And let me tell you why. A saint is explicitly defined by the church as a servant. They are canonized as subordinates.
True.
These goddesses were not defined that way by their worshippers. And if we really want to know if these worshippers viewed these goddesses as subordinates, we have to look at what they actually called them in their own words. This is where the daughters theory completely hits a wall for me.
You're going back to the epigraphic record.
I am, because the explicit titles carved in stone contradict the Quran's framing entirely. In numerous Nabatean and Palmyrene inscriptions, Al-Lat is frequently and explicitly given the title the Mother of the Gods.
The famous Aramaic title.
Exactly, Emalaha in Aramaic. That is not the title of a middle manager. That is a title of supreme autonomous authority.
It is a very strong title.
Think about the mechanics of ancient theology. A mother deity generates power. She is the source of divine life. She holds matriarchal authority. The Quran systematically takes these mothers and shifts them down the generational ladder to daughters.
I have to admit, the title Mother of the Gods carved in stone is a massive hurdle for my argument. It's hard to reconcile that with the idea of a subordinate mediator.
Exactly. Because in the ancient Near East, a daughter is inherently dependent. Her status, her wealth, her legal standing, it is all derived entirely from the patriarch of the family.
It's a position of reliance.
Totally. By framing Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat as daughters of Allah, the Quran is doing the heavy lifting of theological demotion before it even mounts a formal argument against them. It's an incredibly calculated piece of linguistic manipulation.
A rhetorical trick, essentially.
Right. It reframes diffuse, highly sophisticated autonomous religious practices into a sharp, vulnerable doctrinal target. It's much easier to convince a new convert to abandon a dependent daughter than it is to get them to turn their back on the Mother of the Gods.
It is a brilliant theory, but here's where I think we have to separate monumental state propaganda from everyday lived religion.
Okay, how so?
Well, if you're listening to this and wondering, wait, if they had the title Mother of the Gods, why would anyone in Mecca accept them being called daughters? That's exactly the tension the Quran is exploiting, and it exploits it through rhetorical irony.
You mean the passage in Surah Al-Najm about the sons and daughters?
Right. In Surah Al-Najm, the text viciously mocks the Arabs for a specific hypocrisy. It says, essentially, are you to have the male and he the female? What an unfair division.
It's pointing out a double standard.
It highlights a glaring social-moral inversion. I mean, pre-Islamic Arabia was a fiercely patriarchal society where male heirs were intensely prized, and daughters were often viewed as a social or economic burden. The Quran is asking, you devalue daughters socially, yet you assign them to the divine.
It's a biting piece of social criticism.
It is, but here's my point. That specific biting cultural irony would completely fail as rhetoric if the cultural association of these goddesses as daughters didn't actually exist in the lived reality of the Meccans.
You think they wouldn't get the joke?
You cannot mock an audience for a hypocrisy they don't actually hold. Imagine a comedian making a joke about a political party doing something they've never done. The audience just sits there confused.
Right.
If no one in Mecca ever called them daughters, the Quran's joke falls flat on its face. The text isn't inventing the title out of thin air to make them look weak. It's exposing the absurdity of an existing creed that the Meccans were actively speaking aloud in the markets.
But that assumes a unified, standardized Meccan theology, which, we have zero evidence for. Pre-Islamic Arabia wasn't a church with a pope and a catechism.
No, it wasn't.
It was a fluid, tribal society. It's highly likely that the Quran took a fringe symbolic association, perhaps a poetic turn of phrase used by some rival tribes, or a localized Meccan quirk, and artificially inflated it.
Just blowing it out of proportion?
Exactly. It weaponized it as the defining doctrine of its opponents. That is textbook polemics. You take your opponent's weakest, most contradictory idea, and you paint their whole religion with it.
I hear you. But we actually do have historical memory of theological negotiations regarding their exact status as intermediaries. This wasn't just a fringe poetic phrase.
Are you talking about
It brings us to the famous or infamous Quranic incident, often referred to in Western literature as the Satanic verses.
a tradition that later Orthodox Islamic scholars strongly rejected, we should clarify?
Yes, they did. Many later scholars rejected it on theological grounds regarding the infallibility of prophethood, but modern historical critical scholars largely view the preservation of the story in early chronicles like those of Al-Tabari as a genuine historical memory of a theological compromise.
Okay, let's look at the compromise.
And we need to look at how that compromise functioned. According to the tradition, there was a moment of intense tension in Mecca. The early Muslims were being persecuted. The Quraysh, the ruling Meccan tribe, offered a deal.
A power-sharing agreement?
Basically, they would accept Allah's absolute supremacy if the Muslims would recite a verse acknowledging Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat as high-flying cranes whose intercession is hoped for.
Cranes, meaning birds that fly up to the heavens to deliver messages to God?
Exactly. They are literal intermediaries bridging the gap between Earth and the Supreme Creator. And what does that proposed compromise tell us about the Meccan mindset?
That they wanted to keep their system running.
It tells us the Meccan elites weren't fighting for absolute polytheistic supremacy. They weren't claiming Al-Lat was the ultimate ruler of the universe. They were fighting to keep their intermediaries.
Right, the cosmic middle managers.
Yes.
They were perfectly willing to admit Allah was in charge as long as the goddesses could keep their jobs. The Meccans were businessmen. They wanted the spiritual supply chain left intact. That incident proves the intermediary theology wasn't a Quranic invention. It was the actual entrenched defensive line of the Quraysh.
That's a really compelling way to frame the Quranic incident. But if we are going to talk about them as cosmic middle managers, we need to examine what exactly they were managing.
Fair enough.
Because if you look at the domains of these goddesses, you realize that stripping their authority wasn't just a matter of cleaning up heavenly bureaucracy. It was about destroying the very legal and ethical infrastructure of ancient Arabia.
Okay.
And I think this is why the Quran had to linguistically demote them.
You're referring to their role in local governance? I'm referring to the hard epigraphic evidence of their legal domains. Let's look at Manat. We often hear she was the goddess of fate, or destiny, or time, which, sounds very abstract and poetic.
Very philosophical.
Right. But archaeology gives us her explicit legal voice. If you travel down the ancient incense routes to Hegra in modern-day Saudi Arabia, you find these monumental Nabatean tombs carved into the sandstone cliffs.
The famous rock-cut tombs.
Yes. And on those tombs, we find legal funerary inscriptions invoking Manat as a terrifying cosmic enforcer. The stones literally read, "May the curse of Manat and Dushara fall upon anyone who defiles this grave or alters this deed."
So she is acting as a guarantor of property rights.
Exactly. Think about how this society functioned. There is no central state. There is no federal police force out in the desert. How do you protect a wealthy tomb from grave robbers?
You use divine law.
You use divine law. Manat wasn't just a passive idea of destiny. She was actively integrated into the judicial and funerary infrastructure of the ancient highway. And it's the same with Al-Lat.
Right, she played a huge role in the sanctuaries.
The Haima, yes, the sacred enclosures. We have this incredible piece of archaeology called the Lion of Al-Lat. Discovered in Palmyra, it dates back to the 1st century.
Oh, wow.
It's a massive limestone statue of a lion, and between its paws, it is protectively holding a horned gazelle. The imagery is clear. The apex predator is protecting the vulnerable prey. And the inscription on the statue reads, "May Allah bless whoever does not shed blood in this sanctuary."
It's an asylum law.
Precisely. These goddesses were the guardians of peace, asylum, and property. If you had a blood feud, you could go to the sanctuary of Al-Lat and no one could touch you because her curse would fall on them.
They had real-world jurisdiction.
So when the Quran comes along and demotes them to mere daughters, or says they are just names you and your fathers have named, it isn't just winning a philosophical debate about who sits where in heaven. It is launching a direct assault on the existing legal code.
Stripping their authority.
Exactly. By reframing them as powerless, dependent daughters, early Islam was intentionally stripping away their legal jurisdiction so that a new centralized system could take over.
I completely agree on their legal importance, but I would argue that this is the exact reason the theological debate over absolute monotheism was so vital. The theological debate is a legal debate.
How so?
Think of it like the transition from local sheriffs enforcing unwritten town rules to a centralized federal constitution. Claiming ultimate ethical and legal authority required absolute divine centralization.
So the old sheriffs had to go.
Right. As long as you had regional deities like Manat enforcing localized property laws in Hegra, or Al-Lat guarding specific sanctuary zones in Palmyra or Taif, you could never have a unified, universal ethical system under one creator.
But the mechanism of that centralization was linguistic erasure. I mean, the text couldn't beat their legal track record, so it changed their titles.
I view it as theological correction. Tearing down the intermediaries wasn't just a cynical power grab or a trick of language. It was about shifting the very source of law and sanctuary from localized fallible deities directly to the absolute infallible creator.
Okay.
The Quran isn't hiding their legal power. It's arguing that they have no rightful claim to it. If the Meccans believed these goddesses could actually curse tomb raiders and protect fugitives in a sanctuary, well, they were assigning ultimate divine attributes to secondary beings.
Which is associationism.
That is the very definition of the associationism the text is fighting. The stakes were so incredibly high, precisely because the lived reality of these goddesses as active legal managers was so deeply entrenched.
Yes, I am.
And I keep asking, if it was so entrenched, why is the specific daughters phrasing entirely absent from the stones?
Well, stones are formal. I will grant you that the absence of evidence is not strictly evidence of absence. But when we are talking about a civilization that carved its legal codes, its trade agreements, its tomb curses, and its highest theological praises into solid rock, the fact that not a single piece of stone corroborates the central theological charge of the Quran has to give us pause.
It is a valid point of tension.
It heavily suggests that the text is holding up a funhouse mirror to Arabian religion. It is exaggerating certain features, shrinking others, and reflecting a distorted image to create an opponent it can easily defeat.
Or it suggests that the epigraphic record, which is largely formal, monumental, and often commissioned by elites or kings, doesn't capture the fluid, oral, everyday theology of the Meccan streets.
You think it was just spoken?
Right. Inscriptions are formal state or tribal documents. They are the ancient equivalent of a press release. They don't always reflect the nuanced spoken beliefs of a patriarchal merchant society trying to make sense of its place in the cosmos around a campfire.
That's a fair distinction between oral and written culture.
I think if we look at the whole picture, the socio-moral critique regarding gender in the Quran, the historical memory of the Quranic compromise with the flying cranes, and the wider late antique ecosystem where everyone from Christians to Zoroastrians used divine mediators, the Daughters of Allah critique addresses a very real system of shared authority.
Because the people wanted mediators.
Yes. These goddesses were the primary obstacle to strict monotheism precisely because the people truly believed they could broker deals with God.
And I think that while Arabian religion was vastly more complex, cosmopolitan, and globally connected than traditional narratives suggest, we have to recognize polemics when we see it.
You're sticking to the rhetorical shadow theory.
Absolutely. The specific daughter's framing was a brilliant, culturally targeted piece of rhetorical simplification. It masked the autonomous, globalized reality of these ancient female deities, turning mothers of the gods into dependent children.
By changing the language?
Exactly. It bypassed their sanctuary laws by stripping their titles. It was a battle over language just as much as it was a battle over faith.
You know, I think that is a point where we actually find a lot of convergence today. Both of us clearly agree that pre-Islamic Arabian religion was not the simplistic, backward system of crude idol worship that later traditions sometimes portrayed.
Definitely not.
It was highly sophisticated. It was integrated with the global trade routes, and it possessed complex legal and artistic traditions, from the striking and iconic Baetyls of Petra down to the sanctuary laws of Palmyra and Hegra.
Absolutely. The traditional narrative of an isolated, primitive time of ignorance simply doesn't survive contact with the archaeological evidence.
The stones tell a different story.
They do. These were people participating in the grand theological and legal debates of their era. The uncertainty that remains, whether the daughter's theology was an established creed chanted by pilgrims around the Kaaba or a rhetorical shadow cast backward by the brilliant polemics of the Quranic text, well, that's what makes this period so endlessly fascinating to study.
It really underscores the immense value of examining sacred texts alongside hard archaeological evidence. When we take a verse from Surah Al-Najm and we put it next to the Baetyls of Petra, or the Lion of Al-Lat offering a siren, it forces us to understand religious history in a completely new light.
It makes it three-dimensional.
It really does. It reminds us that theology is not just a clash of abstract beliefs floating in the clouds. It is a profound battle over language, over legal authority, and ultimately over memory. We are left, looking back at that ancient map, realizing that the blank spaces were actually crowded with competing, highly sophisticated visions of the divine. Who really held the power in the desert? We'll leave that for you to decide.